And now we have Council Bill 641, Bill for an ordinance to increase the sales and use tax by 0.25% and dedicating the revenue to fund Denver's parks, trails, and open space, subject to voter approval in November. And Councilman Clark, are you going to take the lead on the presentation?
Yeah, I'll kick us off. Thank you. Okay. We'll start by doing some brief introductions, and then I'll kick things off so you know everybody who's here. You know me.
Zach Rothmeyer, legislative analyst.
Warren Jimenez from the Trust for Public Land, part of the Conservation Finance team.
And David Weinstein, also with the Conservation Finance team at the Trust for Public Land.
So the issue that I'm bringing forward today has one that has been talked about for a really long time. So I don't sit here trying to pretend like this was something that I came up with. In fact, as you can see, once we get the thing up here, I'll talk about that in a second. But I serve as one of the council representatives on the game plan task force, and at that first meeting, everybody who was there to talk about game plan and parks was asked to go around and pick one thing that they said was what really needed to happen for parks, and well over 50% of the people in the room said funding. That is the biggest threat to our park system. Before I was on council, I served as Councilman Nevitt's representative on the Parks and Rec Advisory Board, and there are lots of current and former members of PRAB here. This is a debate that we have had through that, and before that, we have community members here today who have been having this conversation probably since before I was born. And then, as you can see from the bill, this is not my bill. This is a bill that's being brought forward as a huge team lift on council, because there are other council members who have been working on this and thinking about this and trying to solve this for a really long time. And so, I think our parks are a critical piece of our infrastructure. We started talking about last night about the livability of communities, the viability of a community for families with our parks. And so I'm excited to, with all of the community members and this body, be able to come forward with a proposal to go to the voters to help fix the problems that we have and expand our park system and make sure that every single resident of Denver has a park that is walkable, that is safe, and that is as a high-quality park. It shouldn't matter where you live, what zip code you're in. You should have that access, and improving our existing parks. We'll get into a lot of that, but I also really want to thank the TPL team. They're here to present, a lot of what we talk about a lot. There's a lot of data behind it, so they're going to go into that. And then want to give a huge thank you to Zach from our legislative team on actually drafting the bill and walking me through a lot of the, you can't put that in a bill, great idea, but we need to stick to this. So with that, I'm going to kick it off to TPL to take it through the first part of our presentation.
Great. Thank you, Councilman. And if you're unfamiliar with the Trust for Public Land, we are a national nonprofit conservation organization that works to create parks and protect land for people to ensure healthy, livable communities for future generations. And we have 4 primary service areas to meet that mission. We have our planning work, we have our funding work, which Warren and I are going to talk more about today, our protect work, which has been our bread and butter for the last 40 plus years, and our create work, which we've got a very strong program here in Denver. Councilwoman Gilmore, in your district, we've got, of course, the great park under construction in Mount Bello. Council President Brooks, Steezo Curtis Park was a great project we worked on, and of course Councilman Lopez, the work in Westwood, and I believe up to 15 other different partnerships that we've got in the past and currently under construction. Conservation Finance was a program set up over 20 years ago to help jurisdictions figure out public funding for their conservation priorities. We've been doing this, again, for more than 20 years, and we've helped to generate over $60 billion across the country in conservation spending, and that is voter-approved funding. And we're really proud to say that 81% of the time that we do engage in this work, voters say yes. And that's because of a very iterative process that really starts and stops with elected bodies. We're not huge fans of going forth with citizen petitions because we think it's important as elected officials here in the City and Council of Denver that you're bought in. And we're very excited about the work that the Mayor's office has done, and certainly Councilman Clark and all the other councilors that are prioritizing parks here in Denver. If you click to the next slide, we really do believe at the Trust for Public Land that great cities deserve great parks. And I think Denver is in a position where you're not only in competition or competing at the national level, but even the international level. As you're about to hear, you have very unique park assets and land that come with very unique challenges. If you pop to the next slide, these are slides you'll probably recognize that come from Parks and Rec Department. But it is very unique to have the amount of acreage that you have here in the city, and then certainly the 14,000 acres in mountain parks. As we like to say at the Trust for Public Land, the work that we do is Main Street to mountaintop, and it's perhaps nowhere as well exemplified as here in Denver. On the next slide, you'll see that you've done an incredible job with down payments and the investments that you've already done, but it's not enough. As recently as last year with the nearly $1 billion package, I know over $150 million did go to parks, but we all understand how bonding works, and in comparison, as Councilman Clark will go into later, to all of your neighboring counties, we find that dedicated sources of funding that are long-standing really do work to meet the needs of parks, for the long haul. As you can see in this slide, at this point in time, a full 1 in 6 park assets are at a poor or very poor condition, and we believe that is in large part due to the fact that there have been great down payments on this work, but you don't have the funding necessary to keep up with the stewardship and the other needs that are necessary. And the deferred maintenance backlog is up to $127 million total, and you can see the annual number of deferred maintenance in this slide. And so you've got your year in, year out appropriated budget and a funding gap, and if you're only bonding and borrowing against this and don't have the ability for long-term operations and maintenance, we're going to see this number continue to rise. And then furthermore, in this context, as we all know, Denver is still growing at a pretty rapid clip. This is an older slide, but again, in 2014, that's a pretty astonishing number. And so I'm sure the population projections have been updated, but the crush continues to come. People want to live here, and people deserve a great park system, and this has a lot to do with, as an economic driver, park equity is becoming increasingly important. I know that's something that you all care about deeply, as well as just being known here in Colorado as one of the great places for environmental resources and as having a high quality of life. I'm going to hand it over to Warren to go into some of the comparable sister cities, as it were, so that you can get a better understanding of what's going on out there in the country. Again, we do this work nationally, and we've got data on and perspective on what some of your competing cities are doing in this realm. Warren's going to go through this, and then certainly we'll be here to answer any kind of questions you've got about the Trust for Public Lands program.
Great, thank you, David. As Councilmember Clark talked a little bit about, he talked about access and being within in a walkable goal to being within access of a park. The Trust for Public Land is leading out on an important established goal that we're talking about nationally, and that is everyone deserves to be within a 10-minute walk of a quality park. And that kind of starts with the foundation of the goal and starts with be able to talk about complex issues like funding issues and how do jurisdictions tackle that particular goal. The other thing that I think it was important to note about is why make the investment? And so we thought we'd talk a little bit about the benefits to the park system. The Trust for Public Land has a history in working in Colorado, and that includes Denver. One of the studies that we did in 2010 was this study. It was an economics benefit study that talked about the benefits of your park system. And one of the key takeaways is the $452 million number. And what that number represents is the value of your existing park system. So if you had to go out and replace your park system today, this is approximately what it might cost. Now we know that that cost was a snapshot in time, and maybe those costs have risen to date. But certainly the idea here is what are some of the benefits that you have in the park system? The other things that we talked about in relation to this study was certainly the environmental benefits, the social benefits to the park system, as well as the health benefits. And so it was really interesting to take a look at what the Denver park system brings, and the idea of making an investment in your system to continue on those benefits for your community. Just to touch on one of those key factors, the health benefit, I think we all know anecdotally what some of those benefits are in being more active in our park system. But we also looked at the data in the Center for Disease Control, and certainly research shows that having access is really, really critically important to keeping people active. And we found that access to those places to be physically active is almost 27% increases in the number of people who exercise 3 days or more per week. And we know that based on the data, even a small amount of being active can make a difference. But unfortunately, a lot of our kids and a lot of our adults aren't meeting even that small threshold. And the other key takeaway to the data is that access piece, with 75% of those folks saying that it's critically important to have access to those park systems. The other thing of note is touched upon already, your process currently that you're getting close to, I know, rounding off and presenting a final plan, but your Denver game plan and talks about some of these key issues in your community, and touching on those 3 core areas around environmental and climate, equity and access, and economic and organizational health. And you all are having those real-time conversations about some of those challenges as well as some of the benefits of making key investments into the system. So how does Denver match up with what you might think of as your comparable cities and how you rank yourselves up against other cities? And so what we thought is talk about some of those data points. The Trust for Public Land annually releases what's called the Park Score. And we have some 2018 hot off the presses numbers that was just released within the past couple weeks. So we'll touch on that real quickly. These are 2017 numbers, but we thought we'd share some of these. The Park Score, in essence, what it does is it gives that opportunity to be able to see how each of the cities and jurisdictions are meeting the park's need. And it ranks the top 100 cities based on population. And you'll see how Denver ranks. There's a list of your top 20 Park Score, 2017 Park Score rankings, and you see that Denver is number 20. And we thought it would be helpful to touch on some of these specific example cities. And so we thought we'd go into the data a little bit further and make some of those comparisons to a few of these cities on the list. And then we also will show some graphical representations on how Denver falls on some of these metrics.
Yeah, can I ask you to do it quickly?
Yeah, I
Because
will.
I want to leave a lot of time for questions.
Okay, will do. And like I mentioned before, this is where the 2018 Park Score is for Denver. And you'll see a trend line there starting from 2014 to 2018, that's the trajectory of the Denver park system. In Minneapolis is a jurisdiction that we thought we'd take a comparison. You'll see their delivery metrics there. We have a 10-minute walk access metric, the spending per resident access, also the parkland percentage of the city, as well as park acres per thousand. You see the numbers there. And this is how Denver compares to some of those metrics. Portland, Oregon, which I think is probably one of the closer comparisons that you all make. There's their metrics on these 4 key data points. And you'll see how Denver compares. You see on the 10-minute walk axis are really close comparisons, but I think you'll see some commonalities that the spending piece, Denver tends to lag behind. Boston, you see their metrics there. The spending per resident was a metric that we anticipate in the future will be increased since they recently passed a funding measure within the past year and a half. But this is how Denver matches up with Boston. And then finally, Seattle. As a comparison city, you see how their metrics line up. And again, just matching that up with where Denver lands on that. So what we did is just took a lot of those same cities and just put it as a graphical representation on where Denver lands on some of these. This is the 10-minute walk access, and you see where Denver lands. Denver, as a reminder, is 86%. You see some of your comparable cities are doing better. This is the spending per resident. And then the percentage of parkland by city. And then the acres per 1,000 residents. So as you all are well aware of, the challenges is certainly three-pronged. One is a growth challenge. The other is the deferred maintenance challenge, and the other is the trajectory of the park system not being able to keep up with your comparable cities. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. And so now we're going to go into the proposal. So again, I want to thank everybody at the table and everybody who sponsored this for all the great feedback that got into the bill. And I'm going to kick this over to Zach to run us through what is in the bill.
So before I get started, I should say that as much as I'd like to take credit for 8 pages of legalese, Troy Bratton prepared this draft. So to address the problems that TPL just mentioned, Council came together with a funding package. So let's take a look at Parks and Recreation's funding as it is now. For the 2018 budget, Parks has asked for about $73 million, which is about a 4.3% increase on last year's budget. And the lion's share of Parks and Recreation budget goes to personnel, which is a little upwards of $50 million. Parks does reclaim some of this cost back, around $10 million, with licensing fees, charges for services. And I should note that the numbers up here do not reflect the Gulf Enterprise Fund. That is completely separate from these numbers. And then also Parks does receive other capital improvement funds from GOCO and other sources. So what the bill actually does, puts a question to the voters for a 0.25% increase on the sales and use tax, which would affect sales, use, and lodging. If voted in, the revenue would be dedicated towards acquiring additional land for parks, open spaces, and trails, developing, improving, and maintaining new and existing parks, including Denver's mountain parks, open spaces, and trails, restoring and protecting waterways, rivers, and streams, purchasing, planting, and caring of trees, and operating and maintaining any additional acquisitions and capital improvements. And Councilman Clark will go through these individually.
So just want to touch quickly on the main point of this is new money for our park system and not replacement money. This isn't just dedicating funds. This is growing the funds that we have. So acquiring additional land, obviously we are, as I mentioned, and everyone knows, we're growing very quickly, and our city is rapidly being developed and at a high density level, and it will never be cheaper to get land to protect for parks. And we have entire communities that are being developed that will not have access to a park if we don't come in and acquire that land. As an example of that, we recently, when I started going down this path, I was talking to some folks with Great Outdoors Colorado, and Denver had the opportunity to purchase a piece of property in Golden Triangle in an area that we have identified as one of those places that our walk score does not, you can't walk to a park from this area. We would have had the first right to bid on this property because it was Colorado Land Board property, so we would not have had to competitively bid. We could have had it appraised and purchased it. We had $2 million of Great Outdoors Colorado money that we could have put to work from the lottery, but we needed to come up with the rest of the money, and we were unable to. So Denver's newest park to be will never be because we didn't have the funding to do it. That's the ones that we're paying attention to, that we're trying to take action on, that come up. We need to go beyond that. We need to be looking at every neighborhood and every community and actively pursuing closing that gap for every citizen. development and improvement. We can't just buy the land, and we need to build high-quality parks, trails, and open spaces. And it's not just about new land. There are parcels in my district, and I would assume across the city, that show up on a map as parks, but when you go there, it's not a park. It is an empty piece of property that we barely even mow. It is not usable. It is not built for people to use, and there are spaces that we can convert into high-quality, usable parks. There's also a big disparity right now in our city between what some of our parks have and other of our parks lack. Often in places, like Wash Park, we have private donors and private foundations that are attached to that park and putting other money in, and we get a level of quality at a park there that is not mirrored, for instance, across the city in another regional park that doesn't have that access. And again, I believe in that it shouldn't matter what zip code you're in. Every single park, you should be able to expect a high quality, usable park everywhere across the city. We also have parks that, before we go to the next one, parks that have adopted master plans that have sat on the shelf, and community went through a process planning and asking for, these are the amenities that we need, this is what we have to do, and we are unable to deliver on that. We had a playground, I should put a picture of that in here, at a park that doesn't even have a name in my district recently, that literally looked like it had been purchased from the playset section of Kmart before it closed, that was sitting there for years and years, and we couldn't replace it because we didn't have the money to upgrade that playground. Protecting and restoring our, I'm sorry, I missed. Yeah, okay. We've set a goal citywide to have a swimmable and fishable waterways. And in the summer, Confluence Park is a swim beach for a lot of Denver residents who don't have access to a pool in their community or can't get into that pool. And we need to deliver on the promise of this being a safe and accessible place for them to be. We also have, the birthplace of Denver at Confluence Park. We started digging. We had a master plan to redo our most historic site in the city, and when we started digging, we ran into coal tar, and that froze the entire project for almost 2 years because we didn't have the funding to mitigate this. Coal tar is one thing at a lot of our parks along the river, and these aren't just riverside like Confluence Park, but at Ruby Hill, there is asbestos from a municipal landfill. So we did this. We know the contaminants are in there, and there are barriers to delivering on parks through these places. And then next slide. Purchase, plant, care of trees. Nobody in this room, I think, will be surprised to hear me talk about trees and the threat from emerald ash borer. When I went to Milwaukee to look at how they were dealing with the emerald ash borer, one of the things that really stuck out to me is in a city like Milwaukee, which is very similar population-wise to us, for their city limit to our city limit. When a tree dies in a park in Milwaukee, 3 trees sprout up in its place and fight, and the strongest one survives. They have to clear forest to create a soccer field. Here, every single tree that isn't on the South Platte River or on the Cherry Creek was planted by someone and needs to be cared for by someone, and the value of that tree canopy in our parks and in our public right-of-ways is something that we've talked about before. We have this threat of the emerald ash borer, and we have gotten ahead of this probably more and better than, thanks to our forestry department, our parks department, and the Be a Smart Ash campaign, than any city in the nation, but we're still haven't even started to grapple with the reality of what it's going to take to preserve our tree canopy wants. We are in full-on loss of our trees, and that's just one tree species. If a pest comes for the honey locust, we'll lose every single tree on the 16th Street Mall, if not another fifth of the trees citywide. There was once a vision that Denver would be a city in a park, not a city with parks in it, and part of that, a big part of that, is our tree lawns and our trees. In Milwaukee, again, a similar size city, their forestry budget ours is a fraction of theirs, and you notice it, you see it, because every single neighborhood that you go through, it doesn't matter what the income of that neighborhood, it doesn't matter what else is going on, there are beautifully maintained street trees that create that park-like feeling everywhere that you go. Next slide. And then operations and maintenance, our park staff does an amazing job with what we have budgeted. But these guys, and I used to, I used to be at the parks every single morning, taking kids on field trips and seeing these guys who are coming and operating our parks and keeping them safe and keeping them in good shape. And they are doing the best with what we've given them, but it's not enough. We had a couple years ago, a group of constituents who reached out to me and said, hey, we're on the Sanderson Gulch, and we've decided we're going to pick up the trash that's constantly down there, but we keep stacking it in the one trash can that's down there, and it's overflowing, and it blows right back into Sanderson Gulch. And when we brought that to the Parks Department, unfortunately, the decision was to remove that trash can because we don't have the money to add those additional shifts to keep up with that trash. So even when we're having citizens help us with maintenance, it's not enough, and that's not the fault of the hardworking people out there. It's that we don't have enough money. The other piece that I wanted to touch on that I missed the slide on was our mountain parks. As was mentioned, is one of the unique things about us. It's also one of the reasons why most people think that we are really high on this park acreage per person, because you count all those acres and all of a sudden things change. And those aren't acres that everyone has access to every day, but it is really a unique amenity that we have. It is 75%, I think, from the slide of our total park acreage, and it is about 1/70th of our budget. We have historic assets. We have this thing that makes us unique in the country, if not in the world, that is severely underfunded. And so that was called out by name, and I'm sorry I missed that on the slide.
That's quick. So what does a 0.25% look like? Look at it'd be an additional $46 million that would be dedicated solely towards parks and parks and open space, and this would be all additional and new money. So.
Do you want me to touch on this slide? Whenever we are talking about a tax increase, there's an extra burden on our citizens, and there are pros and cons to any kind of tax increase that we could go after, from property taxes to sales taxes and through. This was a slide and some statistics that was provided by TPL, if you have questions about it, that shows that, yes, there are downsides to all taxes and all burdens, and if we could pay for everything without ever asking our citizens to pay more, that would be ideal. But as we'll see later, this is the model that all of our neighboring counties are doing. On top of that, in Denver, because we have so many people who come here to shop and come here to work and come here to visit, the burden on our citizens is only 24% of the revenue generated. The rest of that revenue is generated by people outside of the city coming in and spending money in the city. So we're getting $45 million for only a fourth of that burden being on our Denver residents.
So a 1/4 point would take our city and county tax up to about 3.9%, which is still below the average for the metro area, which is about 4%. So, and to compare that, you look around at our neighboring counties, and every single one of them has a sales tax that is dedicated towards parks or open space or a combination of the two. Additionally, municipalities, Arvada and a few others have had instituted other sales and use tax in addition to these county funds. Fort Collins and Colorado Springs also have a dedicated tax that goes towards parks and open space. So looking at the next steps, you're all familiar with the cycle. If we move the process forward, the intent is to have a courtesy hearing on the floor, which would be on July 9th. And before I put it over to questions, there's a few provisions in the bill I want to address. The tax would be in Chapter 53 of the code, so it's not in the charter. This allows council to address any unintended consequences, or as the city grows and matures and our parks mature, be able to address growing needs. All monies from this tax will be put in a special revenue fund, be used specifically for the purposes mentioned in the ballot. It is not intended to offset any current parks and recreation funding. Of the purposes listed, it is the intent of the applicant or the draft that each of these would be touched. It's not a 20% down the board, but it's every year money would go towards each of these causes. There's also a 5% administration cap on administrative cost. This is for administration of the fund, the collecting of taxes and so forth. This does not preclude Parks and Recreation from administrative costs related to the acquisition of additional parkland or other resources that they would develop. Parks and Recreation will submit an outline to council every 5 years of planned fund uses. And Parks and Recreation will also report back to council on what the fund was used for in the previous year.
And I'll just jump in real quick on I know there are a lot of people here today who are very passionate about this, and we're not doing comment in committee, we're doing it on the floor. July 9th date, I haven't checked that with our schedule of what else is going on, or with a lot of the people in the community who want to be here. So that, if you're watching on TV, that date may change even if we get out of committee today. So, that.
Okay.
Question?
Yeah, and under our policy, there should have been a public comment session here at this committee as well. So I was out of town for 2 weeks, so I don't know how that got missed. But,
It's
Okay.
still at the discretion.
It's not. Our policy is that, pardon me, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go
The
ahead.
policy is that if it is a policy change, there will be public comment at committee. It is at the discretion of the chair to add public comment on other items. So for example, a contract or a resolution that ordinarily wouldn't trigger it. But any policy change is supposed to automatically, and so this is like the second time we've had this. I know we're working on some rules revisions, but it is not, it's not discretionary, it's policy.
I will apologize
So,
for that.
yeah.
I'm sure I messed that up, and you were out of town, and I apologize.
Why don't we go ahead and do it and have a question, a special question period?
well, we didn't advertise it to the general
Yeah,
public,
it's
so I
in
would
the-
hesitate
it's in the
to
agenda.
do it now.
It's in there for the clerk's bill.
Yeah, we had public comment for the clerk's bill, but no one signed up, so we didn't have it. Can I ask one clarification before I go to questions? And I only have Councilwoman Sussman in the queue, so if anybody else signaled me and I missed it, let me apologize and get in now. But we were at 10%, we were at 10, well, what was the number? We were very low on percentage of the land area of Denver that is parks. I think it was 10%, right? Is that because it includes the 44 square miles of our airport?
Boy,
I'm just
not
curious.
sure I can answer that question, actually.
Okay.
I know it doesn't include your mountain parks, but we can
Right.
get back to you on that.
Okay, and that was my other question, was does it include the mountain park acreage? And I suppose not. But if it includes DIA, where we don't have people living, I think we'd be higher on the list. So, anyway, Councilwoman Sussman.
Thank you. Of course, I am supporting this. I think it's also an investment in our infrastructure that nature can provide us, which is very interesting. But of course, I had to think about it for a while, like everybody does. And, you know, in our hierarchy of needs, we certainly have a lot of needs in the city, you know, and we'll get questions like this, and I'd like to hear, you know, some of the thoughts that you have of why not a tax for mobility, or, you know, build our sidewalks, our sidewalk infrastructure. Why, although we are doing some things for housing, but certainly housing is a crisis. You know, and in addition, sales tax is regressive. So those are some of the concerns we will hear. Can you give us some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and we are grappling with so many of those issues, and I think we have looked at increasing the marijuana sales tax potentially for housing. We've added a dedicated $500,000 for housing. There's a transportation, you know, potential transportation funding that might be coming up in November. They're all really important things, and we could sit here and come up with a list of 20 things that aren't being funded at the level that we'd like to. This is one that has been being talked about. I mean, we could have seen this coming 20 years ago, that we were going to be at a crisis point, and I think we're very close to that crisis point of really, I mean, if you go to the slide that shows the gap in our deferred maintenance and the hole that we're digging, we have a giant hole, and we're bleeding right now. And we have to not only stop that bleeding, we have to start filling that hole. And on top of that, we have to grow our system, because our city is growing by a huge number of people. And so I don't, you know, I didn't come here with with dreams that I could solve all of those problems, but I do think that the voters deserve a choice on how to solve this problem. And I think we have to continue to be creative and continue to have those conversations about how are we going to close the gap on all of those other things. But it doesn't mean that for now we just say, hey, this is a problem that has been getting bigger, that is going to get to a point where we're not going to be able to crawl back out of it, and not at least give the voters the choice on, is this something that you want to solve? Is this something that you value for the future of our city? Because this is a way to solve it. And again, back to the kind of tax, you know, we could sit down and create something from whole cloth and reinvent the wheel. If you look at, we're the only county that doesn't do this, and our tax rate is you know, a little bit more than that lower than them because of it. And it's a missing piece of the puzzle that there is a strong link here between communities doing this for this purpose. And so that is why I hope that kind of answers some of your questions.
Thank you.
Is that all? Councilwoman Black.
Thank you, and thanks for all your work on this. I am supporting it. I do have concerns similar to what Councilwoman Sussman said, or Susan, we sometimes
Yeah,
call
I
you.
saw that. Our stealth analyst fixed it.
So I don't take it lightly when we increase any fees or taxes because they trickle down to the people who live here. Denver is a very expensive place to live, and taxes and fees impact low-income people more than they impact people who are not low income. So I don't take it lightly. I do think the fact that all of our neighboring counties do have these dedicated funding sources is really important and relevant. And we are getting denser, and I do think it's very important. I, for 4 years, have been working on trying to get a park in one neighborhood in my district. I met with TPL in 2014 about it. They said, for sure, you need a park in this neighborhood. It's getting denser and denser and denser, and they're boxed in by busy roads and highways. So there's definitely a need for this. I'm also concerned about our Golf Enterprise Fund. Just the fact that it is separate and this won't impact it at all. I just think it'll be harder in the future to go forward and get new money for the Golf Enterprise Fund. I know we're talking about doing a master plan for golf, and at some point they're going to probably want to go get some more money, and this is going to make that more challenging. I also am going to Minneapolis, and I'm meeting with their parks people and their Parks Foundation, and I'm super excited about that. But my question is the Highline Canal Trail. So 9 miles of that is in my district. It is really, really important to me in my district. I'm sure everyone knows that. Will the Highline Canal Conservancy be able to utilize some of these funds, or through the Parks Department, will some of those funds be able to use along the Highline Canal Trail?
Yeah, I mean, certainly my hope and my experience working with the Greenway Foundation is you can turn $1 into $2, into $3, into $4, and that this is the basis for us to go leverage with working with those nonprofit organizations in our community who can then go and help acquire Great Outdoors Colorado funding, Urban Drainage and Flood Control District funding, Army Corps of Engineer funding, so that this is that seed money that, again, we had a park in Golden Triangle that GOCO was ready to move $2 million on. That's $2 million that we just left on the table. It doesn't replace that. This allows us to access that. And so we leverage these dollars, especially on acquisition and development, with all of those other dollars.
Okay, and my final statement I just want to make is there are a lot of potential tax increases that are going to be on our November ballot. And I'm comfortable with this one. If they all pass, it is going to really increase our sales tax. And there are shoppers and restaurant goers who actually will make a decision to, especially in my district, in Kevin's district, or your district.
I don't have restaurants.
Right, I know. But you'll go to, Kevin lives right by Southwest Plaza. You know, Stacy lives by Aurora. My constituents go to Park Meadows. And so we have to be careful when we increase sales tax. Shoppers will sometimes make the choice to shop in a different city. And so we all need to be very careful about that.
Is that it?
That's it. I'm done.
Councilwoman Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to delve down a little bit more, Councilman Clark, and so because you talked about supporting the tree canopy, will this also be a funding stream to help with our medians and parkways throughout the city as well, since they usually support trees and vegetation, but it's a responsibility of parks to take care of?
I think, and I'm not completely clear on when always our Parks Department is involved in that versus our Public Works Department. I think anything that falls under public work or under parks in terms of improvements, forestry, the whole forestry department is within there, I think fits into this. But if there are medians that are strictly Public Works maintained medians, then probably not. But all the ones that are parkways and are maintained by parks, I think fall into this.
Okay, great, because my understanding is that Public Works, they only build the medians, and then Parks is responsible for the ongoing maintenance of the medians. And so we definitely in District 11, and I think other areas of the city, struggle with equity around what our medians are looking like and how they're cared for, purely because of a lack of resources that Parks has access to. And so, that's good news. And, to some of my colleagues' questions, I mean, I understand that people will be looking at any increase in sales tax, but I'm happy to say that, you and I, Councilman Clark, have dedicated our entire lives to educating folks about the environment. I have never had a group of children or families that I worked with that have said, we don't want a beautiful open space. We don't want a park in our neighborhood. It's always when we go places and you drive through areas is, why don't we have this? Why don't we have access to this? And so the health benefits, the mental benefits, both mental and physical health, but then also education about career paths are another main piece that our parks and open space can provide. And for many years, we thought that getting children and families up to the mountains was the best way to connect them with nature and to start caring about the environment. But really, at the end of the day, we all deserve to have beautiful parks and open space within walkable distance, and that really helps the entire community then to understand what sort of workforce paths that there really are within natural resources, because there's a whole wide array that we don't ever get to expose our children and families to. And so kudos on doing this. I understand the issue with any sort of increase like this, but when you compare us to our sister cities, they're doing something about this. And so look forward to supporting this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Just a note on time. I think we're going to go a little bit over our closing time, so I want to let Channel 8 know that I doubt that we'll be finished by 3 o'clock because I have 4 more people in the queue. Councilman Brooks.
Is this questions and comments, Chair?
This is questions
And comments. So.
in the form of a question.
Yeah, I think we've made some comments. I'm just making sure. Hey, first of all, thanks for the District 9 park photos. You got me there. Hey, so the 0.25% will be kind of the largest sales tax increase that we've seen in a sales tax initiative. And so can you just talk a little bit about why 0.25 and kind of make the case for that?
I think this slide, looking at what other folks are doing and what is an appropriate funding, but I think more importantly, if you go back to the deferred maintenance slide, I said earlier, we're bleeding and we have a hole. And we need to stop the bleeding. We need to bandage up that wound so that it's not still bleeding. We need to start filling the hole, and then we need to start growing. That's a lot. Yeah. And really, honestly, less than 0.25 doesn't get that. We go to the voters and we say, hey, we've established this problem. We've shown what the gap is, that the gap is getting bigger. We know and we see these new buildings going up, and we don't see a corresponding investment in open spaces as our city gets denser, and it's only getting worse every single day. And if we don't go with at least this much, then we can't deliver on the vision of what this should be spent for. We might be able to wrap a bandage on, but not even stop the bleeding, never name, start filling the hole, and start growing our
That makes sense. And so the 0.25 meets the need.
I believe the 0.25 allows us to stop the bleeding, so that we're not digging a deeper hole, start filling that hole while simultaneously starting to take advantage of those opportunities when land is available or in areas where it is critical for us to develop a park and build a park and start to expand. It's slower doing all of those things at once than if you just focused on one of them, but I believe that this amount of money, it gets us there. It'll be a little bit of a stretch in the beginning, but it will start us on that path to getting that. And less than that, this just will have gone to the voters saying, we've identified a problem and offered you a solution that doesn't solve it.
Yeah,
Unfortunately.
and I think that's hard, and this is, I think it's important that folks know how much the increase is, and it's the largest that we've seen. I guess I would just point to, and I would also say this, that the amazing work that Parks has done in my district has made me an incredible believer in Parks. They've done an incredible job and have transformed people's lives because of it. As a legislator, though, I sit like you, and I can't make a decision in a silo and in a vacuum. There's going to be 7 initiatives on the ballot, and we've talked about this. And this initiative is more funding than anything we're doing for mobility, which is one of the top 2 issues in the city, more than the funding for housing that we have right now, which is 1, and more than we did for preschool program that I helped do the reauthorization for. And so I just think we need to think about that and sit in that for a little bit. I appreciate this. I think everything you said is right on, and in a vacuum, yes, let's make that decision. But 7 initiatives, 1, and then 2, haven't done anything for mobility. And so, and you've kind of addressed that, like, hey, we've got to go after this. And the last thing I'd just say is that I think as a council, we need to start, as we talk about our priorities at the beginning of each year, we need to actually put it on there what we're going to do. And so we haven't really delved into this as a council, and that's what I kind of lament, because this is the first time I'm kind of seeing, like, we're all on board. Are we stacking hands on this? Is this the most important thing that we want to go after right now for a sales tax initiative for 17? And so that's what I meant. But I mean, again, the case, you're making the case. These are the things that I'm struggling with.
Thank you. Councilwoman Kanish.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Great discussion and a lot of good points. I think the process part of this was hard. It was not as robust and long of a process as some of our conversations have been. I also see the value and signed on as a co-sponsor, I think, because of the fact that this is such an important value in our community, and it is really not us making the decision. It really will be in the hands of the voters, and so I think that gives me the assurance that they will weigh some of those things. But I also don't take lightly the need for us to lead, and we have information and daily knowledge that is important, and not every voter has some of the competing needs in their mind. So I hope we'll keep having that discussion. I guess one question, Councilman Clark and I had a really quick exchange about the idea of process, and having come out of the housing fund, the idea of getting a plan for how to spend dollars. Sometimes funding can be more stressful than not funding, because then you really are starting to divide up a pie. And so I do anticipate that that's going to be a challenging process. And I guess I'm concerned, and I just want to put on the record that I think it's critical that this money not just all go for maintenance, and that it has to be used to grow. And we have had a challenge with that. Councilman Gilmore knows well, we've both worked with community organizations that had to fundraise to do improvements for parks because they said we can't grow parks because we don't have the money to maintain them, and that will still be true after this passes. So we can't use that excuse not to grow the system, and the language doesn't require the purchase of new parks, so it's going to be a lot of vigilance if this passes on this body to make sure that it's not all just put into maintenance and that it is used to grow the system. And I think, I think the question about the role of the PRAB, I see that you put them in here as a body to receive the report, but I think that, it's been a process of getting the city used to taking advice on the spending of dollars in the housing realm, and it was required. This is a little lighter on that. So I think that, I think it may be one of those things that I'm appreciative you did this in ordinance and not in charter, because I think that it's important for us to monitor both those things and see whether or not we need to put some more intentional guardrails in there. I'm very hopeful, but it's not easy. Changing the mindset of departments that are used to going through a certain kind of internal budgeting process that only comes out at the end with, pretty final numbers versus like what this requires. I think if the voters approve this, it requires something much more like we did with housing, which is to say we really got to put out there and engage people in how we're spending the dollars. So hopefully the game plan gives us a head start. But those are not concerns that, I think would at all slow me down in supporting this, but I just think they're things that I think we need to watch, and I wanted to get on the record. My only small question, and this is just a really technical one, so it mentions capital improvements. Restrooms would be included in that, is that, I'm looking at Troy over there. And the reason I ask is, we did a little restroom equity map. It's interesting, Northeast Denver, a lot of parks, no restrooms. And it truthfully is the determinant of access. Any parent with a kid knows, and it's kind of a health and safety issue, because guess what, kids gotta go. If there's not a restroom, they're gonna go anyway. So, I wanna make sure that we can use, because I think to make space usable, restrooms are a part of life, and I think our restrooms in the park system have really fallen behind. Our parks are used year-round. Our restrooms are kind of there for a few months. We kind of have the temporary ones where there's permanent ones. But if you have a park without a permanent restroom that's closed in the winter, you don't get a temporary one. And so our bike trails. Anyway, I think so I want to just confirm, is capital would include restrooms?
Troy Bratton, Deputy Legislative Counsel. I think it could, but I think maybe we need to, I can work with Councilman Clark with you to put some kind of parameters on what that definition actually means, because it's really broad right now as operating and maintaining any additional acquisitions and capital improvements. So I think it could now, but we might want to define that specifically.
Anyway, just a small point about how to make, so I'm hopeful we can make sure it's included, but I don't want to mess with the drafting too much after we go out of committee. But thanks.
Councilman Lopez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm really glad that we're actually getting to a point where this is in our committee on the floor for our consideration. I'm excited about this. I think, and Councilman, when you came into this role, I think the cornerstone issue for you was green spaces, and it still is. And sometimes this is good, and it's good coming from a homeboy because you're from here. You've grown up in the system, you've seen it, and you see what we lack, and you see the inequity. And I think that's something that so many people in our community have felt, and it actually defines. It defines your neighborhood. So many neighborhoods are named after the parks that they're in, and vice versa. I think. It is definitely an identifier for us, but unfortunately, it's almost the door swings both ways. It's been our burden, our curse as well too, because of the inequity in our city. Areas that don't have access to parks, or areas with very low park acreage per 1,000 people, are also areas where folks suffer from diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, because there's just no access to recreational activity, or that it's underutilized. And so, this was the story when we walked into office. I walked into office, and we didn't have the opportunity to do something like this because we walked right into a recession. People were talking about cutting and not adding, right, from our budget, and we ignored that. We did it anyway. And we had 2 new parks open for the first time in 30 years in our district because of TPL, because of folks in our Parks and Rec division that said, hey, you know what? Why not push for it? And we put together, it took 6 or 7 years just to get the money together, really scraping, having bake sales just to get a park. And we did, and it was when we opened this park up, and it was designed by the folks. When we opened Cuatro Vientos up, it was like you think somebody got a backloader and said, "Here, whole bunch of cash away," or whatever. It was amazing to see the kind of support, and to this day, that park is full. There's always some activity in that park. Somebody walking around the trails, somebody shooting hoops, whatever it is. And that's kind of been our mantra in the district is to increase that park acreage. And there are areas that we absolutely need that. And we cannot do it with bake sales. We can't just rely on TPL. They've been awesome. We can't just rely on people playing the lottery. We have to do for ourselves. And we have to pay for the city that we want. We can't have this Walmart mentality where we want it cheap and we want it now. We need to get, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say it like that. There are other stores like that too. We get what we pay for, and this is something that I think is one of those things. It's a quintessential question of government, and the purpose of government, when you really boil it down, is to achieve that which we cannot, to achieve that together, which we cannot do by ourselves, and that parks fall under that. So I'm very supportive of something like this. I do appreciate it being an ordinance, although I'm for it being in charter as well too, because I think this is a true value is what you put in that charter. But what's nimble now can be a testament to what happens and what we can permanentize later, or make permanent later. So.
Thank you. Vecino is correct. Council districts 2 and 3, I think, in that southwest corner of the city are the most underparked in the city in terms of park acres per 1,000 residents. And for the life of me, I'm trying to think, where could I put more parks? Say in Harvey Park South, which is one of my denser single-family neighborhoods, but it's all tract housing, it's all built up, and to find some open space there would be very difficult. And you're looking at acquisition there. You're looking at homes because we don't have that much open space left. Pretty much built up. We have Loretto Heights, as a possible opportunity coming down the pike, but outside of that, there's not much in Council Districts 3 and 2. Councilman Clark, I had a couple questions you and I have discussed earlier, so let me ask them here with the TV audience and in public. One of my concerns is that I know the ordinance contains a 5-year plan. 1 year to develop the first 5-year plan and every 5 years thereafter. But how can we be assured that this new money will not end up replacing old money? Because there's an overlap in the allowable uses of this new revenue with what the mission of the Parks Department is right now. So that 5, 10, 15 years down the road, we won't find the median maintenance being handled through this special new revenue when they ought to be doing it out of the old revenue. So what's the mechanism for that?
Yeah, it's a great question and was the number one priority for me going into this, that this was new money.
Right,
But I'm actually going to pass this to Zach, because Zach worked very closely with Peggy on drafting around that, and let him speak to kind of the safeguards.
Great.
So in the chapter 39, in section 39 of the code, there is a paragraph in there that says this money, this fund will not be used to supplant any current Parks and Recreation funding. So that's one safeguard, but the uses, there is overlap in the uses which might free up their budget in certain areas, but I don't see that it would allow a full supplant of the fund.
It was a struggle to find. I wish there was a slam dunk, answer to that. But when you have Tabor and you have to be single subject, and when you have general fund where we're not saying now we're going to freeze in time and all that general fund money is dedicated in a recession when every department is being cut, and we're still paying police officers, there will be cuts to that general fund portion, and the sales tax will dip. So we tried to write it as strong as Tabor would allow, to be very clear in the intent language of the bill, which is not part of the ballot language, but is part of the ordinance that will pass, that it should not be used to supplant that commitment, that level of commitment from the general fund.
Like insinuous.
Yeah, totally fluid.
Lots of fluid.
Bends and curves and.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is a beautiful, one-of-a-kind bed that you can only see in Denver, Colorado, with lots of inlay. So it has orchids inlaid into it.
The fact that, almost 100% of our parks funding currently comes from the general fund.
Sorry. I just want to make sure we still have a quorum. These folks have to leave. And we talked also about why sales tax, and as several other members have brought up, that's a very regressive. Lower income households pay proportionally more than higher income houses. Did you look at a mill levy dedication and which is more reliable, stable, dependable, programmable, as opposed to sales tax, which, as we've seen in 2008 and 9, can really pull the rug out from under you.
As I mentioned earlier, there are pros and cons to any tax, and there's a burden to every tax. For me, we have, with the bond initiative not being an increase in tax, but a continuation of property tax rate, with our activated mill, with the assessed value of homes going up, and with housing being such a crisis, and that being directly passed on, and not that, I think what Councilwoman Black said, that there are a lot of different ways that money can be passed down. There is a direct hit to people being able to stay in their homes and afford that, and to rent through that. And again, with the model at every other county being sales tax, those were the reasons. And the fact that when you look at sales tax, it shows that we have capacity, that our next, compared to our neighbors, we are one of the lowest right now, whereas on housing values, we're one of the highest. And so tacking it to that. So, those were kind of the thought process that I went through when I landed on sales tax.
Okay.
It's not perfect, but I think given the comparison between the two for this function, it's the best.
And finally, did you consider within that new revenue earmarking funds for certain purposes in order to not only to ensure that it's used for the purpose and doesn't supplant current general fund spending, but also, as you mentioned, mountain parks being underfunded in proportion to other parks issues over the years, dedicating certain percentages of that new revenue to certain purposes?
Yeah.
And if not, why?
Definitely something that I considered. Councilwoman Kinich and I were communicating a little bit on this, and maybe an opportunity to strengthen that language. Again, running into the rails on being single subject and not trying to do too many changes so that it is legal to be in front of the voters. And then combined with, from a land acquisition point, being nimble enough that should something like Loretto Heights come forward and the opportunity for a regional park that preserves the view of a building, and all of a sudden it's for sale, for those opportunities, if we were then scaled to only this, we may still be in a position where there's a great opportunity for a park and we can't put it together. And so there are advantages to being prescriptive. There are also disadvantages to being prescriptive. And so that's where I thought a requirement to annually report out to us and to PRAB and to the mayor how those funds were spent, so that we get to weigh in on that, and a forward-looking plan that shows us that the department is weighing all of these various things that this is supposed to fund, that we can have input into, was kind of the middle ground that I landed on.
Okay. Do you have if there are any other questions from members? And if not, we'll entertain a motion as to what to do with this.
I'll just make a quick comment. I'm grateful to the proposer for taking us out of charter, and also not having a board of a bureaucracy of a board that doesn't integrate with our city like another initiative is doing, that I think is going to be hard. I think this will be a lot easier for us to integrate with the Parks Department. And so I will support this going out of committee. And I just encourage you all to do some polling around what's going to happen with all of the initiatives that are on the ballot. I think there's going to be some cannibalization on it, but you just would hate to lose because whatever else is on. So.
All right, I'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Nope. Thank you. We'll see you possibly on July 9th. Do we know